My daughter-in-law tried to steal my inheritance and ended up signing a document that gave me more rights. My name is Grace Green, and for decades I dedicated my life to my family. A widow from an early age, I focused all my love on my only son, created memories, cared for the legacy left by my parents, and kept alive the home we built with so much effort. But with the arrival of a new person into our routine, someone I tried to welcome as a daughter, things began to change. Small gestures turned into great distances. Sweet words transformed into silence and mistrust. And when I realized it, my presence was no longer welcome in my own home. But what seemed like the end of everything became the beginning of something even greater. A story of resilience, wisdom, and dignity. Today, looking back, I see how necessary it was to go through all that to find my true strength. I am immensely happy to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can know how far this story has reached. From the beginning, I tried to love Claire. When Scott introduced her, his voice was filled with youthful enthusiasm, as if he had found the meaning of life. And I, already accustomed to the solitude and silent routine of the house, saw in her the possibility of a new beginning. Claire was beautiful, articulate, kind, at least at first impression. It was almost impossible not to be captivated by her presence. And even if my instinct murmured a warning, I decided to keep quiet. I started to include her in everything. Dinners, conversations about the house, even small decisions about the garden. It was important to me that she felt like part of the family, like a daughter. After all, that's what mothers did. They welcomed, even when their heart hesitated. Scott seemed happier than ever, and seeing that sparkle in his eyes brought me a quiet joy. I tried to convince myself that it was all just an adjustment period. However, there was something that didn't fit. Claire's compliments came loaded with an artificial sweetness, as if she were reciting rehearsed phrases. When she looked at me, it was as if she were measuring every word, every gesture, every silence. I felt she was studying my reactions, as if she needed to understand me deeply, not out of affection but out of calculation. Still, I kept trying to trust, suppressing any judgment. Perhaps it was naivety, or perhaps emotional exhaustion had made me vulnerable to hope. I wanted to believe that everything was fine, that this new phase would bring more unity than conflict. But there was something in her gaze that kept me on alert. At dinner last Friday, something about Scott seemed different. He brought up topics, smiled enthusiastically, but his words sounded strange, as if he had memorized a script. Claire, sitting next to him, smiled with that rehearsed serenity, almost like an actress pleased with her performance. The atmosphere was cordial, but inside something hurt me. A muffled feeling that I was just a guest in my own home. We talked about finances, about plans for the family's future, and Claire led the conversation. She spoke with confidence, proposing modern ideas for asset management, suggesting changes. And Scott agreed with everything almost without thinking. He didn't look me in the eyes. He just smiled and nodded, as if Claire's voice had become the compass of his conviction. I watched in silence, hiding the tightness in my chest. When I tried to weigh one of the ideas, Claire responded before Scott. And he confirmed, as if her opinion was already set in stone. It was at that moment that I realized he was no longer thinking for himself. My house, my son, my history, everything began to slip out of my control. My plate remained full, but my appetite had disappeared. I felt like a spectator in a play where the script had changed without my permission. Claire took over the space with forced lightness, and Scott, who always sought my advice, now seemed to pull away. I smiled on the outside, but inside I fought against the feeling of exclusion. The dinner table, once a symbol of unity, became the stage for a reversal of roles. And once again I wondered if it was just my imagination. But deep down I knew. He seemed to repeat her words as if they were his own. After that dinner, I started walking through the rooms like a stranger. The silence of the house screamed between the lines. My paintings, my photos, my objects were all there, but they seemed out of place. It was as if a new energy dominated every space, molding the house to Claire's taste. I even missed the trivial noises, the familiar smells, the warmth that used to fill that home. Now everything was different. I tried to talk to Scott the next day, but he was in a hurry, evasive. Claire was always nearby, gently interfering, interrupting with smiles. I couldn't have a moment alone with my own son anymore. and every attempt to get closer ended with a quick answer, as if my feelings were inconvenient. I began to question if it was I who was being difficult, if I was getting old and seeing ghosts where there were none. But the discomfort persisted. I started to avoid being around when they were together. What was once a welcoming home now became a territory where I had to ask permission to exist. The small gestures, like changing the living room towel, rearranging the furniture, happened without my consultation. And when I questioned, Claire smiled, saying it was to make my life easier. Nothing seemed mine. Neither time nor space nor affection. I tried to adapt, to maintain my composure, not to cause conflict. But inside, something was silently breaking. The feeling of being a decorative presence, a living memory of a past they tried to erase, slowly consumed me. That was no longer my family, and I needed to understand why. I struggled to believe that it was all in my head, that the growing discomfort came from a place of insecurity, perhaps jealousy over my son's new phase of life. I tried to remember that changes require adaptation, and that it was natural for there to be friction between different generations. Claire was trying to help, I told myself. I repeated these words so many times that I almost convinced myself they were true. I went back to gardening, to resuming small habits that gave me a sense of control. I started going out more, meeting old friends, distracting myself. But, upon returning, there was always something different. A changed curtain, a repositioned piece of furniture, a decision made without my opinion. When I asked, Claire smiled and said, "I thought you'd like it." The tone was sweet, but there was something in it that silenced me. Scott, in turn, seemed oblivious to any discomfort. He remained excited, full of plans, too busy to notice the subtle change taking over the house. I wanted to believe it was just adaptation. I wanted to trust that time would put everything in its place. But no matter how much I pretended not to see, there were gestures, glances, and silences that screamed truths I didn't want to hear. I began to realize that Claire never confronted me directly. She smiled, helped, praised, but her actions always emptied my space. She was like an elegant shadow that occupied everything without raising dust. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, her silence was louder than 1,000 words. It was a trifle, a tiny detail that on a normal day would have gone unnoticed. Claire commented about changing the signatures on the house checks to make things easier, and I instinctively said it wasn't necessary. The answer came quickly, but what struck me was Scott's reaction. He turned to me, eyes narrowed, as if I were exaggerating. He tried to laugh, saying I was being stubborn. That laugh wasn't his. It was artificial, rehearsed, and carried a slight tone of impatience that had never existed between us. Claire beside him kept smiling but said nothing. She didn't need to. My son had already taken her side, without even realizing there was a side. The discomfort that was once an intuition transformed into subtle, but constant, evidence. I tried to argue, but the conversation changed direction. Scott deflected. Claire made light comments to ease the mood. It was as if I were being re-educated to yield, not to question. And worst of all, I began to notice that my own son looked at me strangely, as if I were complicating something that, to him, was simple. For the first time, I felt there was a real distance between us. After they left the room, I sat on the sofa alone, staring into space. My heart was heavy, but my pride tried to convince me that it was just a phase. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the pain. But a part of me, the most silent and profound, knew that something was breaking. For the first time, my son looked at me with distrust. It was then that I understood. If I kept deceiving myself, I would be erased little by little. Claire wasn't attacking me. She was simply occupying the space. And Scott, without noticing, was handing her the keys to my world. I decided I could no longer act as if nothing was happening. The pain of accepting this was great, but the pain of being an accomplice to my own exclusion was greater. I started to observe more. Small gestures, restrained smiles, exchanged glances. I waited for moments when Claire thought I wasn't around. I noticed how confidently she spoke about household matters, how she assumed roles that once belonged to me. I started noting details, dates, phrases. I didn't know exactly what to look for, but I knew I needed to be attentive. Every piece of information, every behavior, became part of a puzzle I didn't know where it would lead. I became a spectator and investigator of my own life. Sometimes I felt ridiculous for being suspicious, but at other times I felt my intuition guiding me down a necessary path. A solitary but inevitable path. That night, before going to sleep, I looked at the dark ceiling of my room. Everything was quiet, but inside me there was a turmoil. I didn't want to believe that my family was slipping from my hands, but I wanted even less to be surprised by the truth too late. If I was right, I needed proof. That morning I went downstairs earlier than usual. The silence of the house still reigned, but muffled voices caught my attention. It came from the office, whose door was only ajar. I recognized Claire's voice, but the surprise was hearing an unknown male voice. I approached slowly, my heart pounding and my feet light, almost dreading to discover what I already suspected. "Trust me, Dad, she doesn't even read the papers anymore," Claire said with conviction. "Scott will sign anything I suggest." The man replied something I didn't fully understand, but the tone was one of approval, almost celebration. It was Larry, her father. I had seen him at a distant meeting before, but never so intimately involved in our home. Their complicity sent a chill down my spine. My urge was to open the door at once and confront them, but I held back. They continued talking about stages and documents already in progress. The words were vague, but the meaning was clear. Something was being orchestrated, and I was the obstacle. I returned to the hallway without making a sound, trying to organize my thoughts and control the impulse to act rashly. The game was silent and I needed to play it too. The confirmation of Claire's and her father's involvement in household matters destabilized me. That explained her growing power over Scott and the decisions that were slipping from my hands. But more than that, it revealed a plan, a calculated move disguised as kindness. They spoke softly, but I understood enough. I spent the entire day reliving that conversation in my mind. The words, the tones, the naturalness with which they spoke about me as an obstacle. Something inside me changed. I could no longer be passive. I waited until Claire and Scott left in the afternoon and went straight to the office. I didn't know exactly what to look for, but my hand seemed guided by the intuition that had haunted me for weeks. I started with the oldest drawers, filled with forgotten papers. Everything seemed in order, until I found a navy blue folder, newly added, with papers still unclipped. There, among stamped and recognized sheets, I saw what floored me. Documents about asset management, authorizations, transfers of small properties, and even joint accounts, but none of them with my recent signature. My name appeared as the holder on old sheets, but gradually disappeared on the new ones. There was no doubt. They were gradually replacing me, subtly but constantly. Line by line, what was mine was becoming common use, with Claire always present as the new co-author of decisions. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The betrayal was no longer in doubt. I put everything back in its place with the care of someone walking on glass. Now my suspicion was fact. But exposing everything immediately would be the final mistake. They were plotting with time, precision, and calculation. And I needed to do the same, but with help. My name was being erased line by line. It was at the end of that week that the unexpected happened. Caroline called me. We hadn't spoken in months, but her firm, familiar voice brought me immediate comfort. She said she had dreamed about me, that she was worried. I can't explain why, but I broke down on the phone. I only told her what was necessary, and she, with that typical calm, asked me to meet her at the cafe where we used to go. The next day, I sat before her as if stepping back in time. Caroline listened to every word in silence, without rushing questions. When I mentioned the documents, I saw her expression harden. "Did you keep copies?" she asked. I denied, still unable to believe the gravity of what I was narrating. "Then from now on everything needs to be documented," she said, with the firmness of someone who knew that kind of war well. She spoke little, but every sentence was precise. She said that sometimes people take advantage of others' kindness, especially when those others are tired, widowed, aging, and that justice exists to protect the naive who trust too much. When she hugged me before leaving, I felt a relief I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, I wasn't alone in that labyrinth. I returned home with a firmer breath and a more attentive gaze. I was no longer just a spectator, now I was an active part of a silent struggle. And if they thought I had no strength, they were about to discover otherwise. She looked at me and said, "You are not alone, Grace." Scott appeared with a bouquet of flowers on a Wednesday afternoon, smiling with that particular way he had when he wanted to ask for something important. We sat on the porch as we used to when he was a boy, and he began the conversation with compliments, memories, and affection. Then, with a softer voice than usual, he spoke about organizing the inheritance during my lifetime. He said it was to put my mind at ease, that everything would be simpler that way. Claire wasn't present, but I could feel her words between the lines of every sentence Scott uttered. He talked about practicality, legal security, avoiding future disputes. But I knew my son. He had never been interested in this type of subject before. The proposal smelled of rehearsal, and however calm his voice was, his eyes trembled. I looked at him for a moment too long. The silence between us was cut only by the wind. I smiled, squeezed his hand, and said I would think about it carefully. Inside my stomach churned. Scott believed he was doing something good, but he was being manipulated. And accepting or refusing immediately would be foolish. From then on, every step needed to be calculated with precision. I went back inside the house and closed the door firmly. The first piece of the game had been moved. Now it was my turn to act with strategy and time. He smiled, but his eyes apologized. The next day, I went to Caroline's with the envelope in my hands. We sat in her kitchen with hot tea and the tension throbbing between us. I handed her the papers without saying anything. She read carefully, turning the pages slowly, making notes in silence. Her face showed no surprise, only focus. When she finished, she placed the document on the table and took a deep breath. "It's an elegant attempt to exclude you from the process," she said. "But none of this is valid if you don't sign." I explained that I had pretended to agree, and she nodded with a small smile of pride. "They're rushing, that's their mistake," she commented. She picked up her old leather folder and began to separate some contract templates. "You will sign something, yes, but it will be on our terms." That phrase reignited a spark within me. I was no longer just resisting, now I was acting. Caroline explained that we would need another ally, someone with up-to-date technical knowledge. It was then that she mentioned Julia, her lawyer daughter. I remembered the determined girl who had studied with us in our youth. Now, she was a woman with a firm gaze and precise gestures. I left Caroline's house with the papers in my bag, and a new plan forming in my chest. Claire had opened the game, and now it was my turn to counterattack. But with intelligence, with calm, and with the power of truth on my side. She analyzed the paper and murmured, "Here's our chance." Julia arrived 2 days later, with a laptop in hand and a serene demeanor. We talked at length in Caroline's living room, where she listened attentively. She asked specific questions, noted dates, names, phrases spoken by Claire and Scott. There was no judgment in her gaze, only analysis. After a moment of silence, she said, "We will draft something that seems favorable, but that guarantees your total protection." She explained that legally there were loopholes that could be used in our favor, clauses, addendums, technical terms that confuse laypeople, but are crystal clear to those who know what to look for. We would propose an intermediate document, which would seem advantageous to Claire, but which would give me irreversible authority over the assets. And most importantly, it would be something she would sign with her own hands. I was impressed by the clarity of the strategy, but above all, by the respect with which Julia treated my story. At no point did I feel fragile, I felt valued. Caroline by her side was the foundation I needed. We were setting up a new game, where the rules would be ours, and no longer imposed by false smiles and veiled manipulations. Before saying goodbye, Julia looked at me and said, "You haven't lost, Grace. You were just waiting for the right moment." At that moment, I felt that there was still room for justice, even after so much silence and betrayal. If Claire wanted a game, she would get one more dangerous than she imagined. Julia suggested we schedule a casual conversation with Claire, to show goodwill. We chose the living room with tea served, as if it were just an afternoon between women discussing family. Claire arrived punctually, dressed in her usual elegance and a smile of false humility. Julia introduced herself sympathetically, saying she was just a family acquaintance, helping with legal details of estate planning. The proposal was presented as an intermediate solution, a temporary agreement, which would expedite processes without leaving anyone out. Claire read the document quickly, pretending to analyze it carefully. Julia had carefully drafted each line, inserting clauses in technical language, deliberately camouflaged. My heart pounded, but my face remained serene. We knew Claire's haste would be our greatest ally. She seemed satisfied, perhaps believing I had finally yielded. She signed lightly, crossing her legs with an air of victory. Julia thanked her, collected the papers, and ended the meeting with formal phrases. Claire left the room confidently, like someone who believes they have planted their flag at the top of the mountain. And I, for the first time in a long time, smiled in silence. Julia looked at me knowingly and said, "First stage completed." We knew the war was still far from over, but we had won the first battle. She signed without hesitation, thinking she had won. With the document in hand, I went to Caroline's the same day. We sat in her office, surrounded by old folders, papers kept with care and respect for our family's memory. She opened her deepest drawer and pulled out an envelope already yellowed with time. "I kept this just in case," she said, placing my father's original will on the table. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes shone with conviction. The will made it clear that the assets would pass to me with restrictive clauses, protecting the estate from third parties, marriages, or associations. Claire could not touch anything, regardless of any recent contract, as long as I remained alive and lucid. Caroline explained that, even if new signatures appeared, the will would have superior value in case of a legal conflict. It was the legal route no one had foreseen. That brought me indescribable comfort. It was like finding forgotten armor on the battlefield. While Claire invested in recent papers and manipulated promises, we were anchored in an old but solid protection. Caroline smiled and said, "Strength is not in the new. It is in what resists time." And at that moment I understood that we were not just reacting, we were preparing to win. I closed my eyes for a second, feeling my father's hand guiding me through the memory of that will. That was not just a document. It was inheritance, protection, dignity. Caroline closed the folder firmly and said, "This will is stronger than any new contract." From then on, the plan took definitive shape. Julia would draft a complimentary addendum to the agreement signed by Claire, taking advantage of the points she herself had validated. This new addendum would include clauses that seemed to confirm the previous terms, but which in practice would return all control to me, legitimately, but invisibly to lay eyes. The strategy was risky, but calculated with surgical precision. To work, we would need Claire to sign without reading deeply, which didn't seem to be an obstacle. Her haste, her overconfidence, and her thirst for control worked in our favor. Julia would use technical terms and an identical visual structure to the previous contract, so as not to raise suspicions. I would just have to maintain the appearance of gratitude and conformity. Meanwhile, Caroline would ensure that the old will was registered and accessible, in case of any questioning. The pieces of the chessboard were moving, and every gesture needed to be meticulously controlled. I was slowly becoming a player in the game that had once excluded me. And as painful as it was, I was ready to go to the end. The fate of my assets, my history, my dignity was at stake. But this time with allies by my side and truth in hand. The chess game was about to have checkmate. Claire began to pressure Scott more frequently. There were calls, messages, comments casually made, always bringing up the need to quickly resolve the inheritance papers. She claimed to be worried about my health, about the family's future, about avoiding legal conflicts. All dressed up with good intentions, but with too much urgency for someone who claimed to only want to help. Scott, naive, also started to insist. At each new lunch, he brought up the subject, trying to convince me that it would be better for everyone. "It's just a formality, Mom," he would say with a smile that didn't hide his doubt. Claire accompanied everything with smiles and perfectly served coffees. But I saw the tension hidden beneath her impeccable nails. She wanted to speed up the process, and this thirst for control was her weakness. Julia and I followed the plan. I maintained the role of a calm and collaborative mother, while Caroline took care of keeping the old will securely filed. The stage was set for the final move. And the more Claire insisted, the more I saw her confidence turn into precipitation. She didn't want family security. She wanted haste. And haste is the enemy of the clever who think they are invincible. Every time she repeated that it was just a detail, I smiled. I knew that the more she downplayed the importance of the paperwork, the more likely she was not to read it carefully. She was too anxious. And that gave me an advantage. Julia worked with a surgeon's precision. The addendum seemed harmless, with technical terms placed in the right places, entire paragraphs drafted in legal jargon. On the outside, it was a confirmation of the previous agreement. On the inside, it transferred all decision-making authority and asset control directly to me, irrevocably. Her signature would be a legitimate and voluntary endorsement. All legal. All elegant. She used phrases like formal consolidation of the terms already agreed upon, and legal stability between the interested parties, which would seem like useless bureaucracy to someone in a hurry. The appearance of the document was identical to the previous one, and Julia even took care of the letterhead, spacing, and signatures. All subtle. All invisible to distracted eyes. It was a trap made with silence and patience. Our plan depended on a single factor: Claire's self-confidence. And she had it in spades. Julia and I met almost daily to review every line, to anticipate every question Claire might ask. Caroline followed from a distance, ensuring that, even in case of contestation, we would be legally protected. The castle was ready. All that remained was for the enemy queen to invade it. That weekend, Julia delivered the final document. "It's all here," she said, looking at me with the firmness of someone who knew the weight of that move. I took the folder with trembling hands, but with a firm heart. If she reads it in a hurry, she signs her own trap. The meeting was scheduled for a clear Monday morning. Claire arrived confidently, praising the room's decor and complimenting the coffee as if everything were under control. Scott seemed relieved, thinking they would finally resolve the paperwork. Julia remained discreet, presenting the documents as a simple formality, and Claire didn't even hesitate. She picked up the pen before anyone even said anything. She signed quickly, smiling, satisfied with what she believed was another achievement. Scott also signed without questioning. I was the last. I took the pen calmly, signed, and returned the paper with steady hands. Inside, I was in absolute silence, the kind of silence that precedes irreversible victories. That signature was not the end. It was the beginning of a new story. We said goodbye cordially. Claire left the room lightly, like someone who had just conquered a throne. But I knew. On that paper she signed in such a hurry, was the seal of my regaining power. I didn't need to confront, scream, or take revenge. All it took was intelligence, strategy, and time. Claire fell into her own game and barely noticed. When I closed the living room door, I leaned against it for a moment and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time I felt safe. And free. She smiled. And I signed too, sealing my invisible victory. Claire began to walk around the house as if on a stage prepared exclusively for her. Her decisions, once subtle, now came with authority. She changed curtains, dismissed old service providers, reorganized the kitchen cabinets. She started receiving visits from her friends without consulting me, occupying the spaces that were once dedicated to our family's intimacy, all under the pretext of modernizing or improving the environment. The worst part wasn't what she did, it was how she did it. With the certainty that nothing would stop her. Her gestures carried an inflated confidence, and her voice took on an almost directive tone, especially when Scott wasn't around. I watched in silence every move. The game she thought she had won was just beginning for me. And the more she felt like the owner of everything, the more fragile her foundation became. The last straw was one afternoon when I came into the living room and noticed that the portrait of Scott and me had disappeared from the main wall. I asked Claire calmly, and she replied that she had redecorated to give the environment more lightness. I stood motionless for a few seconds, looking at the emptiness where our history once lived. The message had been sent. I no longer belonged to that narrative. I went back to my room and faced my own image in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was wounded, but not defeated. I took deep breaths in silence. And in each silence I planned more firmly. She ordered my painting to be removed from the main living room. I continued to feign conformity. My steps were calculated, my words measured with precision. With each invasive gesture from Claire, I offered a contained smile. Caroline and Julia guided me cautiously. We kept receipts, recorded dates, kept everything documented. Nothing was left to chance. The power was already mine, but it still needed to be revealed at the right moment. Caroline always reminded me, it's not just about winning, it's about making it count. And I understood. Justice is not made only with evidence but with time. The right time to show clearly who acted out of greed and who resisted with dignity. While Claire celebrated her false victory, we prepared the true outcome. It was like building a castle in the dark, brick by brick without rushing. Julia was meticulous, reviewing all contracts, taking care of every legal step. What seemed harmless to Claire was, in fact, the structure that would support our defense. I, in turn, grew stronger with each gesture of contempt I received. I learned to transform pain into focus. My silence was not surrender, it was strategy. I was not absent. I was present in every detail. The house filled with voices that were not mine, but within me there was a growing certainty. And in Claire's every step I saw her mistake, underestimating those who grow old in silence. Sometimes the best weapon is patience. It was Scott who started noticing first. Once he saw me cleaning the living room cabinet and commented that everything seemed different. I just smiled. Another time, he came home early and witnessed Claire giving orders to an employee, harsh, undisguised orders. He remained silent, but his gaze changed. He began to see through the curtain Claire had drawn between us. One Sunday lunch, Claire mentioned she was thinking of redistributing functions in the house, as if I were just a guest. Scott cleared his throat, uncomfortable. He asked, almost without meaning to, if she had talked to me first. She deflected, and I took the opportunity to praise his old way. More attentive, gentler. He looked at me differently, as if he wanted to go back in time. Every gesture of Claire's now caused him discomfort. The words he once repeated without thinking now came out slower, as if weighing on his tongue. He still didn't know everything, but something inside him was beginning to change. It was as if the fog was slowly dissipating. And deep down I knew, Scott's heart could still be reached. It was that late afternoon when I was alone on the porch that I felt something new. Scott looked at me from afar and, for the first time in a long time, his eyes sought me with sincerity. My son looked at me like someone searching for the truth. Justin's visit was unexpected and at the same time providential. He had been our family's accountant for many years, someone trustworthy, until he stepped away after my husband's death. When he reappeared, it was with a thick envelope in his hands and a serious look. "We need to talk," he said, sitting at the table with Caroline, Julia, and me. What he carried wasn't just paper. It was the key to exposing everything. Justin recounted that some time ago, Larry approached him to review some documents in Claire's name. He found it strange but didn't pay attention at the time. Only now, upon hearing rumors about movements on my part, did he decide to investigate. He cross-referenced data, accessed old bank records, and connected transfers in the name of shell companies. All led to the same place. Claire and her father. Julia quickly flipped through the papers. The documents showed silent movements of funds and small properties, made with simulated signatures or fragile authorizations. Some amounts had passed through third-party accounts, but the traces were there. Claire was not just trying to anticipate an inheritance, she was already diverting part of it. My fingers trembled as I saw her and Larry's names linked to the figures. I looked at Caroline and felt the confirmation I so feared and needed. There was the material proof of betrayal. But, more than that, there was the confirmation that I was never crazy nor paranoid. Here's the money trail you needed. With the documents in hand, Julia began preparations silently and surgically. The action would be carried out with caution, without alerting Claire or Larry. No confrontations, no premature warnings. The law would be our ally and justice the path. I fully trusted Julia. She studied every line, consulted colleagues discreetly, and above all made sure nothing was rushed. Meanwhile, I did what I always knew how to do, observe. Claire continued her act, but now with a slight uneasiness in her eyes. Perhaps she already felt something slipping through her fingers. Caroline told me to stay calm, that the hardest part was over. But I knew the right moment would be decisive, and that the strength of a response lies in the silence before the impact. Scott still didn't know everything. I spared him for now, but I knew that soon he would see with his own eyes who the woman who claimed to love our family truly was. It was difficult to maintain serenity, but I had a greater goal: to protect the legacy I built with my husband, and to regain the space that Claire tried to take with sweet words and poisonous actions. Next to Julia I felt safe. Each saved document was a layer of protection, a shield against injustice. I didn't want revenge, I wanted balance, dignity, respect. It won't be revenge. It will be justice. Claire began to suspect. Her glances became quicker, her questions more frequent. One night she asked me directly, "Are you hiding something from me, Grace?" I replied with the calm that only truth allows. "Nothing you don't already know inside." She laughed, but her eyes hardened. The mask was starting to crack. And she knew it. A few days later, noticing one of Julia's envelopes on my desk, Claire burst into my room without knocking. She started screaming, demanding explanations, asking if I was trying to harm her. Scott heard and intervened, trying to calm her down, but she wouldn't be contained. She pointed a finger at me and said, "You're digging your own grave." That was no longer charm. It was despair. My response was silence. I stood up, walked to the door, and without raising my voice asked her to leave. Scott looked at me, confused, as if he didn't recognize the woman now yelling in the center of the room. Claire noticed, and her fury overflowed like a runaway river. It was there that her true face was completely revealed. She screamed, her eyes filled with rage, words that could never be taken back. She screamed, "You will regret it." But it was too late. I prepared that meeting as if it were the final act of a long and painful play. The room was organized, with chairs arranged in a circle, as in the meetings we used to have as a family. Caroline, Julia, and Justin were with me, ready to support every word with evidence. I called Scott, Claire, and even Larry, knowing that it would be impossible to avoid the final confrontation. The atmosphere, despite its tranquil appearance, was charged with tension. Scott arrived first with a serious expression. Claire and Larry entered afterward, visibly suspicious of the formality of the invitation. "What's going on, Mom?" my son asked, while Claire maintained a defiant gaze. I took a deep breath and asked them to listen to me until the end. There would be no shouting, just facts. It was time to face everything that had been built with manipulation, haste, and greed. Caroline began the conversation, explaining the reason for the meeting. Justin distributed copies of the documents, while Julia clarified each technical term. Claire tried to interrupt, saying it was unnecessary. Larry crossed his arms, restless. But I remained calm. I was there as the guardian of my family's history, not as a victim, but as a survivor of a game I never asked to play. I held my hands in my lap and faced each one of them. My eyes met Scott's, and he seemed to understand that this moment would change everything. Today, everyone will know who is telling the truth. Scott took the documents and read them in silence. He started slowly, but as he read, his expressions changed. The transfers, the records, the connections between Claire and Larry. Everything was there, clear as day. He looked at his wife, expecting a reaction and explanation. But Claire remained silent, her face hardened. The lack of response was worse than any justification. "Claire, is this true?" he asked, holding the paper firmly. She hesitated, trying to smile. But there was no mask that could hold up in that moment. "They're exaggerating. This has no legal value," she mumbled. But Justin and Julia interrupted her, pointing out the clauses, the signatures, the banking trails. The lie was surrounded by evidence, and there was no elegant escape. Larry stood up, saying he wouldn't respond to unfounded accusations. But it was too late. The truth was already exposed. Scott stood up, stunned, and stared at Claire with tears in his eyes. "You used my name. You used my mother. You made me believe this was out of love." She tried to approach him, but he recoiled. The cut had been made, deep and irreversible. I held back my tears, maintaining my composure. But inside, a part of me was set free. The pain of being forgotten by Scott was replaced by a spark of hope. He finally saw. He finally understood. He said, "You lied to all of us." When Claire tried to argue, Julia handed over the last document. The addendum she had signed in such a hurry, without even reading it properly. It was the final blow and the most silent. Scott took the paper, read each line, and looked at me in astonishment. "She signed this?" he asked. Julia confirmed with a slight nod. "Of her own free will. With witnesses." Claire snatched the paper from his hands, but it was too late. "This is a trap," she screamed. But it wasn't. It was merely the consequence of her own choices. Justin explained patiently that the document stripped her of any power over the assets. And more, it returned all rights to me with irreversible legal force. Claire looked around, searching for an escape, some way to turn the tables. But there was no more game, only its end. She tried to appeal to Scott, saying that everything was for love, for the protection of the family. But he remained immobile. "You lost, Claire," he said in a low voice. "And you still haven't understood that it was your own fault." She turned to me, eyes full of fury, but said nothing more. She picked up her purse, lifted her chin, and left. I stood there, my heart pounding, looking out the window as she left the house. She left the house with the same paper she thought gave her power, now turned against her. The following days were filled with silence, but a different kind of silence. For the first time in a long time, it didn't hurt, it just rested. Scott started seeking me out more often. Timid at first, like a son returning home after getting lost. We would sit on the porch as before and talk about simple things. The garden, dinners, memories of his father. Gradually, our conversations began to fill the empty spaces. He apologized many times, but I interrupted him with a hug. A mother's love survives even the longest silences. I felt that deep down he always knew. He was just blind, caught in a web of half-truths. Now there was a reunion. And a reunion, when it comes after pain, has a deeper flavor. He started listening to me again, considering me, and more than anything, trusting me. We reorganized some things in the house together. We moved furniture, donated old objects that carried bitter memories. It was a new beginning, subtle but full of meaning. The house began to breathe at our rhythm again, and I became a living part of it once more. Scott looked at me with pride, and I with forgiveness. That's how family was reborn. On the last summer afternoon, he hugged me without saying anything, and in that silence I felt something healing completely. He called me Mom with tears in his eyes. Justice took its course discreetly but surely. Julia handled everything with rigor and patience. The evidence gathered by Justin was handed over to the authorities, and both Claire and Larry became investigated for fraud and asset manipulation. It wasn't about revenge, it was about responsibility. Someone needed to answer for the damages, not only material but human, they had caused. I received some calls from lawyers, proposals for settlements, attempts to resolve things outside of court. But I refused them all. Caroline supported me in every decision, firm as always. Claire, who once spoke with such authority about justice and security, now faced the true scales of the law. And contrary to what she expected, she didn't rage. She simply disappeared, surrounded by her own silence. Larry tried to negotiate, saying he acted out of paternal obligation. But no excuse was sufficient. They knew what they were doing, and they did it anyway. They forgot something fundamental. Inheritance is not just patrimony. It is memory, respect, history. And no signature in the world can erase what is built with truth. The law serves not only to punish but to protect. Today I follow everything from a distance, without haste, without anger. I don't want to see them suffer. I just want them to acknowledge the harm they caused. This time they will have to answer before the law. Mornings returned with the smell of coffee and fresh bread. I walked through the hallways of the house with firm steps, reconnected with every corner, every memory. The garden flourishes like never before, and even the birds seem to sing with more freedom. Sometimes I sit in the armchair in the living room and just observe. The light coming through the window, the quiet furniture, the gentle sound of life and peace. I think about everything I've lived through, the days I felt invisible, the swallowed words, the unspoken tears. But I also think about the hands that helped me up, Caroline, Julia, Justin, and even Scott when he finally woke up. It was all worth it. Because resisting isn't standing still. It's knowing the right moment to act. And acting with wisdom. The house is no longer just a structure. It is reclaimed territory. It is a symbol of who I was, who I am, and what I will leave for those who come after. I no longer need to prove anything. The truth has already spoken for itself. And it echoes in the walls, in the memories, in the future I can now see with serenity. I close my eyes and take a deep breath, knowing that my place never stopped being mine. Not every battle is won with strength. Some are won with wisdom. Now, I'm curious about you who heard my story. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Have you experienced anything similar? Support the channel, subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. I'm leaving another story on the final screen that you will also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. Until the next video.